still on the DNS topic, and this has to do with creating new domain names as well, but for a completely different purpose, right?
Right. So there's a company called CloudShield. They put out a report that there's a new type of DNS-based DDoS attack being seen in the wild. Mm-hmm. The basics of it are that there is something called a start of authority, or an authoritative record or authoritative server for mm-hmm. DNS, and that's when you have a domain name that has subdomains, and you'd like to have one server be designated to say, I know everything about this zone or mm-hmm. everything under this subdomain. Please ask me all the questions related to it. So what's happening is these attackers will register domains. They'll register tons of these domains, but I'll boil it down to just a single domain for the sake of simplicity. They'll register a domain, mm-hmm. and what they'll do when they register it is they will configure it so that the start of authority is the victim. So, and there's nothing that prevents this. This is just simply a server configuration somewhere in DNS, and it
mm-hmm.
says, any questions you need to ask, you ask this guy about it, and that's your victim. So what will happen is that someone will try and resolve that domain and at an open resolver or any other DNS resolver out there on mm-hmm. the web, and the question will be forwarded on to that start of authority because, who's to say they're not the person who's responsible
right.
for it.
Right.
So what will happen is the attacker will then, using his botnet army, start making requests for subdomains of this domain. And they'll randomize it. They'll make a whole bunch of junk requests for subdomains, and they'll keep changing it so that these domains aren't cached
right.
at the server. Because if it's cached, that means the resolver can say, I already know about that. I've already mm-hmm. got your answer. Mm-hmm. If you keep creating new ones, that's a brand new request that has to be forwarded on to the start of authority every time. You can mm-hmm. probably see where this is going.
Right.
Then the resolver is making these requests to that start of authority, which has no idea what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't even have to be a DNS server. It probably has more of an effect if it is. But what you've created is you've got these resolvers making tons and tons of requests on your behalf, and when they time out, it'll ask again, mm-hmm. because that's the start of authority. It has no other place to look for the answer to that question, but its job is to get that question answered for you.
Right.
And the devices making the query to the authoritative server that's really not the authoritative server, that's the target, mm-hmm. are all legitimate DNS servers. So
yep.
you can't really block them, right,
mm-hmm.
without having some other adverse impact to your legitimate services you might
right.
be trying to provide there. So interesting tactic, right? I'm sorry to interject.
Yeah. No, you've got it exactly right.
Yeah. So is this really more work? I mean, it looks clever. Is it really more work than is really? I mean, is there really an angle of this that would be particularly effective?
I think it has a better chance of working, one, if your target is already a DNS server,
mm-hmm.
and two, if you're attacking somebody who has some pretty decent DNS DDoS protections
mm-hmm.
in place. If they've got some sort of rate limiting from certain IP blocks that they're not familiar with,
right.
or they have some sort of filtering put in place to prevent the typical DDoS of DNS, which is just any arbitrary box on the internet making these
right.
requests at you.
Mm-hmm.
If you're already a trusted DNS server and your job is to ask these kind of questions, there's probably a chance that you've been filtered or you're given a little more permission to do the kind of requests that are being used here in this attack.
Okay.
Here's what I think is interesting about this. So a lot of times we'll see spoofed DNS amplification attacks, right? So you
mm-hmm.
get this army of bots, they spoof the source IP, they send the packets out to open DNS resolvers, those DNS resolvers send it back to whatever IP address. And that doesn't even have to be,
mm-hmm.
The target doesn't have to be a DNS server. This allows you to do it if you don't have the ability to spoof packets. So maybe
right.
you have a
point.
bunch of bots in your network in your botnet, I should say,
mm-hmm.
that do not have the permission to spoof, because maybe you don't have root on them, maybe they're web servers that you compromised, whatever. Now you can actually just create DNS queries to your legitimate DNS server who's going to proxy it for you to this authoritative DNS server who's really the victim in this case.
Mm-hmm.
And so you skirt around any kind of BCP38 ingress-egress filtering type of things to prevent spoofing.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need to spoof. Allows you to still kind of commit the same kind of attack, in theory, by distributing your attack,
mm-hmm.
and obfuscate who your bots are. So you're hiding
right.
who your
right.
actual bots are behind an army or a layer of legitimate DNS servers.
Yeah. Okay,
If you
good
split
point.
up the attack between different DNS servers on different ISPs, it becomes even harder to track down who the originators of the request are. You've got to talk to every single ISP.
Mm-hmm. Okay, all good points. I think so. I guess it really kind of leads to the point where you really need some type of a high bit bandwidth mitigation capability at layer 7 on the front. That is, you're going to have to filter on the domains, the bogus domains that have been created, and recognize those as basically NX domains. Filter them on the front end so that you can manage the bandwidth going into the actual DNS servers, right?
And the other thing that I think that article had pointed out is right now there is no vetting going on of when you create a domain and you set your authoritative records in your
Right.
whois record, and that gets kind of put up to the root level servers for like .com or .org, whatever you're in. There's no kind of vetting process to say that what I just put in here is true.
Right.
So I could put in, when I register this rogue domain, I could put in whoever I want to be my victim instead of the legitimate DNS server that should be authoritative for this
Right,
domain.
absolutely.
And if they had some vetting of those, the authoritative
Yeah,
records
the
there,
authoritative. Yeah, then basically they
that would help.
put them in a path of approving that is, yes, I am authoritative for that domain that's been registered.
I'm not quite sure how you would implement that. I'm not saying, but
Well,
if it could be done,
it could be
that
part
would
of the
be a way to
registration
do it.
process to be able to validate it. That's a good point. So hopefully we'll be able to work on some corrections in this. In the meantime, I think it's a matter of recognizing the type of attack, which is the reason we're sharing it here, so it can be recognized, and secondly, to be able to have the capability in place to scrub the bad domains out before you overload any DNS infrastructure on the way in. All right, good.